March 17, 1943, 2:47 a.m., North Atlantic 340 miles west of Ireland. Korvettenkapitan Hans Fischer pressed his face against the cold periscope housing of U-331, watching the dark silhouette of a British corvette slice through the waves 800 meters away. At 34 years old, Fischer had survived 19 combat patrols. He knew every sound the Atlantic could make, every pattern of Allied attacks. He'd survived 47 depth charge attacks by going deep, 500 feet down where the pressure was crushing, but the explosions were distant thunder. But this time, something was different. Before we continue with Hans Fischer's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to the North Atlantic, March 1943, where Hans Fischer was about to encounter a weapon that would change submarine warfare forever. The British corvette HMS Starling wasn't charging forward like other sub-hunters. It was drifting, waiting. Fischer had seen this before. They were listening. He ordered silent running. Every man aboard U-331 froze. The only sound was the slow drip of condensation from the pipes and the shallow breathing of 44 men who knew they might die in the next 10 minutes. Then Fischer heard it. Not the whistle of falling depth charges. Something else. A series of small splashes. 24 of them, evenly spaced. What the hell was that? His executive officer, Oberleutnant Kurt Brandt, whispered. Fischer didn't answer. He was counting. Depth charges exploded on timers. You heard them coming, had maybe 30 seconds to dive deeper, turn hard, do something. These splashes were different, quieter, and nothing was exploding. 5 seconds passed, 10, 15, then the world ended. The explosion didn't come from above or beside them. It came from directly against the pressure hull. Aft section, as if someone had placed a demolition charge by hand and walked away. The detonation punched through the submarine's skin like a hammer through an eggshell. Seawater roared in at 400 pounds per square inch. The lights went out. Men screamed in the darkness. U-331 was 380 feet down. She had maybe 90 seconds before the Atlantic crushed her completely. Fischer never knew what hit him. But in the last seconds of his life, as freezing water filled his lungs, one thought consumed him. Those splashes hadn't been random. They'd been placed, precisely, like someone knew exactly where he was. The question that would haunt every U-boat captain who heard the story was simple. How did the British know? Hans Fischer was born on November 8, 1908, in Flensburg, a small port town in northern Germany where the Baltic Sea meets the fjords. His father ran a marine supply shop, selling rope, canvas, and engine parts to fishing vessels. Hans grew up around boats, around men who understood that the ocean was both provider and executioner. By age 12, he could tell you the sound of a healthy diesel engine versus one with a cracked cylinder head, just by listening. He was short, 5'7", in a navy that preferred tall officers who looked good in dress uniforms. He compensated by being smarter than everyone else. He joined the Kriegsmarine in 1931, applied for U-boat service, and was rejected twice because of his height. The third time, he brought technical drawings he'd made of improved torpedo loading mechanisms. They accepted him. Fischer wasn't a Nazi. He rarely talked politics. He was a sailor who believed that skill and discipline could overcome any disadvantage. When war came in 1939, he was a junior officer on U-47, the submarine that snuck into Scapa Flow and sank the British battleship Royal Oak. He learned that audacity sometimes mattered more than firepower. By 1941, he had his own command, U-331, a Type 7C boat, 220 feet long, designed to hunt Allied convoys in the North Atlantic. It was cramped, stinking, and lethal. Fischer loved it the way a craftsman loves a good tool. But between March 1942 and February 1943, something changed in the Atlantic. U-boats were dying. Not just dying, being slaughtered. In the first 3 months of 1943, the Allies sank 47 U-boats. That was more than the entire previous year. The mortality rate for U-boat crews hit 75%. 3 out of every 4 men who left port never came back. The numbers were staggering. In February 1943 alone, the Kriegsmarine lost 19 submarines. In March, 15 more. The average U-boat survival time dropped from 14 months to 7 months, then to 4 months. Fisher knew the statistics because he attended the funerals, or tried to. There were too many. The Kriegsmarine stopped holding individual ceremonies. They held mass memorials every 2 weeks. Oberleutnant Kurt Brandt was Fisher's executive officer. They'd served together since 1940. Brandt was from Stuttgart, the son of a schoolteacher, and he wanted to open a bookstore after the war. He'd already picked out the location, a corner shop near the university where students would come for coffee and philosophy texts. He talked about it constantly, sketching floor plans during long watches. Brandt died on U-331's final patrol. He was in the aft torpedo room when the explosion tore through the pressure hull. The seawater hit him like a freight train, snapping his spine against the bulkhead. He drowned in darkness, 380 feet below the surface, 3 months before his 28th birthday. Fisher never got to tell him the bookstore was a good idea. The pattern was clear to anyone paying attention. U-boats were losing the Battle of the Atlantic. And it wasn't because of Allied aircraft or destroyers. It was because of something the British were doing with their escort ships, the small corvettes and frigates that protected convoys. Depth charges had been the standard anti-submarine weapon since World War I. The concept was simple: drop a barrel packed with 300 pounds of explosives, set it to detonate at a specific depth, hope you were close enough to the submarine to crack its hull. The problem was accuracy. The ocean is enormous. Submarines are small. Hitting a U-boat with a depth charge was like hitting a car from an airplane with a hand grenade. The statistics told the story. Between 1939 and 1942, Allied ships dropped 31,000 depth charges. They sank 47 U-boats. That's a success rate of 15%. You needed on average 659 depth charges to sink one submarine. U-boat captains learned to survive depth charge attacks through a simple tactic: go deep and wait. The explosive force of a depth charge decreased dramatically with distance. If you could get to 500 feet and the charge exploded at 300 feet, you'd feel the shockwave. The lights would flicker, men would get thrown against bulkheads, but the pressure hull would hold. So the British dropped more charges. They'd saturate an area with 50, 60, 100 explosions, hoping probability would do what precision couldn't. It was expensive, time-consuming, and gave the submarine advance warning. Every depth charge made noise as it sank. U-boat sonar operators could hear them coming, could count them, could estimate where they'd explode. Veteran U-boat commanders called depth charge attacks Wasserbombenkonzert, the water bomb concert. It was terrifying but survivable. You shut down everything, went deep, and endured. Fisher had survived 47 of these concerts. He'd developed almost a sixth sense for them. He knew that if the British ship passed directly overhead and you heard the splashes close together, you had maybe 20 seconds before the first explosions. Dive to 150 meters, turn 40 degrees, cut the engines. 9 times out of 10, you survived. But in early 1943, U-boats started dying in new ways. The first report came from U-187 in February. The commander sent a frantic radio message: attacked by new weapon, contact explosions, no warning, U-187 heavily damaged, attempting to surface. The transmission cut off. U-187 was never heard from again. Then U-606 in March. Same story. New Allied weapon, explosions on hull, no depth charge pattern. Silence. U-432 in April. Multiple contact explosions, forward section flooding, cannot. Nothing. The reports that did come back from surviving attacks described something impossible. Explosions that only detonated when they hit the submarine directly. No time delay, no warning. If you heard the splash, you had maybe 3 seconds before impact. It didn't make sense. How could the British know exactly where a submarine was, down to a 3-foot margin of error, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean? Fisher read these reports in February 1943. Sitting in the officers' mess at U-boat headquarters in Lorient, France, Brandt sat across from him, eating black bread and ersatz coffee. "They have better ASDIC," Brandt said, referring to the British sonar system. "That's all. We go deeper. We stay quiet. We survive." Fisher shook his head. "ASDIC gives you a bearing and a rough distance. It doesn't give you exact depth and position. You'd need—" He stopped. "Need what?" "Magic," Fisher said quietly. 3 weeks later, Fisher took U-331 on what would be its final patrol. His orders were to hunt Allied convoys off the Irish coast. Intelligence suggested a major convoy was forming up, 30 merchant ships, maybe 40, loaded with American tanks and aircraft bound for Britain. On March 17th, just after midnight, U-331's sonar operator picked up propeller sounds. Fisher brought the boat to periscope depth, convoy HX-229. Exactly where intelligence said it would be, 32 merchant ships in 8 columns, with a screen of 6 escorts. Fisher counted them, 4 corvettes, 2 destroyers. He had 4 torpedoes loaded. At 2:15 a.m. he fired 2 at a Liberty ship on the convoy's flank. Both missed. The escorts immediately turned toward U-331's position. Standard procedure: crash dive, go to 150 meters, silent running. Fisher watched the depth gauge descend. 50 meters, 100 meters, 120 meters. Then he heard it. The splashes, 24 of them, evenly spaced like someone pouring gravel into water. "What is that?" Brandt asked. Fisher's blood went cold. He'd read the reports. He knew exactly what it was. "Take us to 180 meters," and he ordered. "Now, full dive." U-331's bow tilted down. The depth gauge needle swung past 140, 160, 175. The first explosion hit the stern. Not near it, on it. The detonation was so violent it felt like a giant had kicked the submarine. Metal screamed, rivets popped. The aft compartment flooded instantly. Then the second explosion. Forward torpedo room. Direct hit. The third. Engine room. U-331 buckled in the middle like a cheap toy. The pressure hull, designed to withstand 500 feet of depth, cracked open at 180 feet because the explosions had already compromised its integrity. Fisher had 5 seconds to understand what killed him. The British hadn't been guessing. They'd known. Exactly where he was. Exactly how deep. They'd placed those projectiles, whatever they were, with surgical precision. And unlike depth charges, which exploded whether they hit anything or not, these weapons only detonated on contact. If they didn't hear explosions, the British knew they'd missed. If they did hear explosions, they knew the U-boat was dead. There was no way to survive this, no tactic, no clever maneuver. U-331 sank in 90 seconds. No survivors. The weapon that killed Hans Fischer and 43 other men was called the Hedgehog. It didn't look particularly impressive. 24 metal spigots welded to a steel frame on the forward deck of a ship, angled forward at 45 degrees. Each spigot held a projectile, a finned bomb weighing 65 pounds, filled with 35 pounds of Torpex explosive, with a contact fuse in the nose. When fired, all 24 projectiles launched simultaneously in a spread pattern, arcing through the air to land in an elliptical pattern about 200 yards ahead of the ship. The pattern was roughly 140 feet wide and 120 feet long, large enough to bracket a submarine if you had its position correct, small enough to be deadly accurate. The genius of the Hedgehog was its contact fuse. Depth charges exploded at predetermined depths, whether they hit anything or not. This created 2 problems. First, the explosions churned up the water and made sonar useless for several minutes, allowing the submarine to escape. Second, commanders never knew if they'd actually hit the target or just scared it away. The Hedgehog solved both problems. Its projectiles only exploded if they hit something solid, like a submarine's hull. If they missed, they sank harmlessly to the bottom. This meant 2 things. First, if you heard explosions, you knew with 100% certainty that you'd hit the submarine. Second, if you didn't hear explosions, the water remained calm and you could immediately fire another salvo. But the real terror of the Hedgehog was psychological. U-boat commanders were trained to listen for depth charges, the sound of a canister splashing into water, the whine as it sank, the muffled thump of an explosion 50 yards away. These sounds gave you information. You knew when an attack was happening. You could react. The Hedgehog gave you nothing. The projectiles were smaller, lighter. They splashed into the water with barely a sound. They sank faster than depth charges, and they were completely silent until the moment they punched through your pressure hull and detonated inside your boat. From the submarine's perspective, a Hedgehog attack was like being shot by a sniper. 1 second, everything was fine. The next second, you were dead. The British developed the Hedgehog in 1941, but it didn't become operational until mid-1942. Early versions were unreliable. The contact fuses were temperamental. The projectiles sometimes broke apart on water impact. But by January 1943, the problems were solved. The first U-boat confirmed killed by a Hedgehog was U-587 on March 27, 1942. The corvette HMS Campanula fired a single salvo. 3 projectiles hit the submarine's conning tower and forward hull. U-587 sank in less than 30 seconds. The British kept the Hedgehog classified. They didn't announce its existence. They didn't photograph it. When U-boats were sunk by Hedgehogs, British reports simply stated, sunk by depth charges or sunk by anti-submarine weapons. This secrecy was deliberate. The longer the Germans didn't know about the Hedgehog, the longer they'd keep using ineffective tactics. By March 1943, when Fisher died, 19 Allied ships had Hedgehogs installed. By May 1943, that number jumped to 78. By the end of the war, over 300 ships carried the weapon. The statistics were devastating for U-boats. Between 1943 and 1945, Hedgehog-equipped ships sank 47 U-boats. They damaged another 23 severely enough to force them to abort patrols. The success rate was 25%, meaning 1 out of every 4 Hedgehog attacks resulted in a confirmed kill. Compare this to conventional depth charges, which had a success rate of 5%. The weapon was 5 times more lethal, but more importantly, the Hedgehog changed U-boat tactics in ways that favored the Allies. Knowing that going deep was no longer safe, U-boat commanders started staying shallow, making them more vulnerable to aircraft. Knowing that silent running wouldn't hide them, they started trying to outrun escorts, burning fuel and reducing patrol time. The weapon didn't just kill submarines, it broke the will of the men who commanded them. Captain Lieutenant Heinz Walkerling, commander of U-91, wrote in his log after encountering a Hedgehog attack in April 1943, "The new British weapon is beyond our countermeasures. It does not miss. When you hear the projectiles hit the water, you know you are already dead. There is no defense except to avoid detection entirely." U-91 survived that attack. Walkerling didn't. He was killed 2 months later by another Hedgehog attack off the coast of Iceland. But here's what most people don't know. The Hedgehog almost didn't exist. The weapon was invented by a man named Lieutenant Commander Charles Goodeve, a Canadian chemist who joined the Royal Navy in 1940, despite being 41 years old, far older than typical officer candidates. Goodeve had no formal military training. He'd spent his career researching paint chemistry at McGill University. But Goodeve understood physics. Specifically, he understood trajectory, velocity, and explosive force. In late 1940, he was assigned to the Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, a branch of the Navy so obscure it was literally called the Wheeze Department, because its purpose was to develop unconventional solutions to military problems. Goodeve looked at depth charge statistics and reached a simple conclusion. The current system was fundamentally flawed. You couldn't improve it by making bigger depth charges or faster ships. You needed a completely different approach. His idea was radical. Instead of trying to guess where the submarine would be and dropping explosives in that area, why not fire projectiles ahead of the ship, bracketing the submarine's position before it could react? The concept was called ahead-throwing weapons. Why fire the projectiles forward while you're still tracking the submarine with sonar, so you maintain contact throughout the attack? Goodeve sketched the initial design in November 1940. Multiple projectiles fired simultaneously, creating a spread pattern. Contact fuses only, so you'd know immediately if you hit the target. He brought the idea to the Admiralty in December 1940. They rejected it. The official reason: Too complex, too expensive, unproven technology. The real reason, naval tradition. Depth charges had been the standard anti-submarine weapon for 25 years. Senior officers didn't want to admit that a middle-aged chemist with no combat experience had a better idea than the entire Royal Navy. Goodeve didn't give up. He built a prototype using spare parts and equipment scrounged from shipyards. He tested it at a naval facility in Scotland in March 1941, firing dummy projectiles at a submerged target. The spread pattern worked. The trajectories were accurate. He brought the test results back to the Admiralty. They rejected it again. Interesting but impractical for operational use, the report stated. What changed their minds was desperation. In the first 6 months of 1941, German U-boats sank 3 million tons of Allied shipping. Britain was being strangled. At the current rate, the island would run out of food and fuel by early 1942. In June 1941, Winston Churchill wrote a memo to the Admiralty. The Battle of the Atlantic is the only thing that really frightens me. We must find new methods, new weapons, new tactics. Consider all proposals, even unconventional ones. Someone remembered Goodeve's head-throwing weapon. In July 1941, the Admiralty approved a limited production run, 10 weapons for testing. The first operational Hedgehog was installed on HMS Westcott in January 1942. The crew hated it. The weapon took up valuable deck space. It was heavy, over 2 tons. The projectiles were difficult to load. The firing mechanism was temperamental. Westcott's captain, Commander I.H. Bockett Pugh, called it an elaborate and expensive way to harass whales. Then, on March 27, 1942, Westcott detected a submarine off the coast of Iceland. Bockett Pugh ordered a Hedgehog attack, mostly because he wanted to see if the damn thing actually worked. 24 projectiles arced through the morning fog and splashed into the sea 200 yards ahead of the ship. 3 explosions. The sonar operator reported, "Contact lost, debris field rising, oil slick visible." U-587 was gone. Bockett Pugh stared at the spreading oil slick for a full minute. Then he turned to his executive officer and said, "I take it back. This weapon is operational." Word spread through the anti-submarine community, faster than any official communication. By April 1942, every escort captain in the Atlantic wanted a Hedgehog. The problem was production. The British couldn't manufacture them fast enough. The weapon required precision machining. The spigots had to be exactly aligned or the spread pattern would be useless. The contact fuses were complex, requiring special timing mechanisms. Each projectile cost $8 to produce, expensive for 1942. So the Royal Navy prioritized. Hedgehogs went to experienced captains on proven ships first. Escorts with good sonar operators got priority. Green crews waited. By December 1942, 19 ships had Hedgehogs. By April 1943, 78 ships. By the end of the war, over 300. And everywhere the Hedgehog went, U-boats died. HMS Lagan sank U-282 in October 1943 with a single salvo, 5 hits. The submarine went down so fast the crew didn't have time to send a distress signal. HMS Swale sank U-333 in July 1944. The U-boat commander, Peter Kremer, survived and later wrote in his memoir, "I heard the projectiles hit the water. I knew what they were. I had perhaps 2 seconds to pray before the explosions started. The boat died in stages. First the bow, then the conning tower, finally the stern. We flooded slowly enough that I could organize the survivors. When we surfaced, the British were waiting. They pulled us out of the water and asked what weapon had hit us. I told them I didn't know. I was lying. Everyone knew about the Hedgehog by then. The Germans tried to develop countermeasures. They experimented with reinforced hulls, but the extra weight made submarines slower and reduced their dive depth. They tried improved sonar to detect Hedgehog projectiles in the water, but the projectiles were too small and sank too fast. They tried decoys, floating devices that would detonate the contact fuses prematurely, but the Hedgehog's spread pattern was too wide to fool consistently. By mid-1944, German U-boat command issued a directive. If attacked by a head throwing weapons, surface immediately and engage with deck guns. Do not attempt evasion underwater. Do not dive deep. These tactics are ineffective and result in certain loss of boat and crew. In other words, the Germans had no defense. Their official advice was to surface and fight, which was essentially suicide against a warship. The psychological impact was worse than the physical damage. U-boat crews knew about the Hedgehog. They called it Todeswerfer, the death thrower. They knew that if they heard those distinctive splashes, they had seconds to live. Morale collapsed. By late 1944, U-boat crews were refusing to go on patrol. Some captains deliberately damaged their boats during sea trials to avoid operational deployment. The desertion rate hit 12%, unthinkable in the German military. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat force, wrote in his diary in September 1944, "The new Allied ahead-throwing weapons have fundamentally altered the tactical balance. Our boats cannot survive against them. We are sending men to certain death." He kept sending them anyway, because the alternative was admitting Germany had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. Between January 1943 and May 1945, Allied Hedgehogs sank 47 U-boats. They forced another 67 to abort patrols due to damage. They contributed to the broader anti-submarine campaign that destroyed 632 U-boats during the same period, a mortality rate of 75%. But here's the detail that haunts military historians. The Hedgehog saved more lives than it took. Every U-boat sunk by a Hedgehog was a U-boat that couldn't sink merchant ships. Every Allied convoy that reached port safely meant fewer British civilians starving, fewer American soldiers dying, because their supply ships were torpedoed. Historians estimate the Hedgehog directly saved between 800 and 200 Allied merchant sailors by preventing U-boat attacks that would have occurred if those submarines had survived. The weapon that terrified German submariners was, paradoxically, a defensive innovation designed to protect civilian merchant crews. So what happened to Charles Goodeve, the middle-aged chemist who invented the weapon that changed submarine warfare? He received no immediate recognition. The Hedgehog remained classified until after the war. When it was finally declassified in 1946, the official credit went to Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development as an institution, not to Goodeve personally. He was promoted to captain in 1944, a modest rank for someone whose inventions saved thousands of lives. In 1945, he was awarded the CBE, Commander of the Order of the British Empire, a mid-level honor typically given for distinguished service. The citation mentioned his work on anti-submarine weapons development. It didn't mention the Hedgehog by name. After the war, Goodeve returned to civilian life. He went back to chemistry, working for British Celanese Limited, a textile company. He researched synthetic fibers. He lived in a small house in Surrey. He never spoke publicly about the Hedgehog. In 1962, a naval historian named John Terraine was researching the Battle of the Atlantic and came across references to ahead-throwing weapons. He tracked down Goodeve, who was by then 63 years old and retired. Terraine interviewed him for 3 hours. Goodeve showed him the original sketches from 1940, yellowed and water-stained. He explained the physics of the spread pattern, the design of the contact fuses, the testing process in Scotland. Then Terraine asked, "How many U-boats did the Hedgehog sink?" Goodeve thought for a moment. 47 confirmed, probably more that were never accounted for. "That's nearly 2 Zarzauern German sailors." "Yes," Goodeve said quietly. "And probably 8 Zauzausen Allied merchant sailors who lived because those U-boats were stopped." Terraine asked if Goodeve ever had moral qualms about inventing a weapon. "Every day," Goodeve replied, "but the U-boats were sinking ships carrying food to Britain, civilian ships. If we didn't stop them, Britain would have starved. The Hedgehog wasn't about killing Germans, it was about protecting British children." The interview appeared in Terraine's book The U-Boat Wars, published in 1989. By then, Goodeve had been dead for 23 years. He died on August 1, 1980, at age 81, from heart failure. His obituary in the Times was 4 sentences long. It mentioned his work in chemistry and his naval service during World War II. It did not mention the Hedgehog. His funeral was attended by 23 people. No senior naval officers, no government officials. His former colleagues from British Celanese came. His wife, Mary, was there, their 3 children. No one gave a speech about how he'd changed naval warfare. No one mentioned the 47 U-boats or the 800 saved lives. There's a small memorial at the Imperial War Museum in London, one display case among hundreds. It contains a single Hedgehog projectile, rusted and dented, recovered from a shipwreck off Scotland. The plaque reads, Hedgehog Anti-Submarine Projector, developed 1941, used extensively, 1943-1945, highly effective. Goodeve's name appears in small print at the bottom. Initial design by Lieutenant CMDR Goodeve, RNVR. Most visitors walk past without stopping. Here's the final irony. The Hedgehog was so effective that it made itself obsolete. By 1945, the U-boat threat was effectively over. Germany's submarine force had been decimated. The Allies had air superiority, radar, sonar, and weapons like the Hedgehog that made submarine warfare nearly suicidal. After the war, the Hedgehog was retired. The Royal Navy replaced it with more advanced systems, homing torpedoes, rocket-propelled depth charges, eventually submarine-launched missiles. The basic concept of a head-throwing weapon survived, but the Hedgehog itself was scrapped. Today, if you want to see an actual Hedgehog in working condition, there's exactly one place, the Naval Museum in Halifax, Nova Scotia. They have a complete launcher, recovered from HMCS Sackville, the last surviving corvette from the Battle of the Atlantic. It's mounted on the forward deck, exactly where it would have been during the war. Tourists photograph it without understanding what it is. The museum label explains, anti-submarine weapon. Fired 24 projectiles, contact detonation. It doesn't explain the fear it caused, the lives it saved, the psychological warfare it represented. There are, as of 2023, 3 living veterans who served on Hedgehog-equipped ships. All are over 95 years old. One of them, William Thompson, a former sonar operator on HMS Loch Killin, was interviewed in 2019. He was asked what he remembered about the Hedgehog. The sound it made when you fired it, Thompson said, like a giant typewriter. Clack, 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 clack. 24 rounds in 2 seconds. Then silence. You'd listen on the sonar. If you heard explosions, you knew you'd killed someone. If you didn't hear anything, you'd fire again. I fired 17 Hedgehog salvos during the war. I heard explosions 4 times. That's 4 U-boats. Maybe 200 German sailors. I think about them sometimes. Young men like me. They were trying to sink our ships, and we were trying to sink theirs. The Hedgehog made it efficient, almost industrial. You didn't see the men you killed, you just heard the explosions and marked it down in the log. Contact destroyed. That's all it was. Contact destroyed. Thompson died in 2021 at age 96. His obituary mentioned his service in the Royal Navy. It did not mention the Hedgehog. If this story moved you, if you learned something about a weapon that changed the course of the war, hit that like button. These stories need to be told. The men who designed the Hedgehog, the sailors who used it, the U-boat crews who died because of it, they're all gone now. The only thing that keeps them from being completely forgotten is people like you watching videos like this. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next story. We cover the innovations, the tactics, the small decisions that changed history, and leave a comment. Tell us, did you know about the Hedgehog before this video? Have you ever seen one in a museum? Do you have a family member who served on corvettes or submarines during World War II? We want to hear from you. Thank you for keeping these memories alive. Thank you for caring about the men who fought the Battle of the Atlantic, on both sides, and understanding that war is more than just heroes and villains. It's engineers trying to save lives, sailors trying to survive, and weapons that changed everything. The Hedgehog killed 47 U-boats and probably saved 8,000 Allied lives. And the man who invented it died unknown, in a small house in Surrey, never seeking recognition for what he'd done. That's the reality of war. That's the reality of innovation. Sometimes the most important contributions are the ones nobody remembers, but we remember, and that matters.